双语音标领航，注音阅读启蒙，叶兴阳有声读物。
Essays of Travel by Robert Louis Stevenson. Contents: I, the amateur emigrant. From the Clyde to Sandy Hook. The second cabin. Early impression. Steerage impressions. Steerage types. The sick man. The stowaways. Personal experience and review. New York. 2. Cockermouth and Keswick. Cockermouth. An evangelist. Another. Last of Smethurst. 3. An autumn effect. 4. A winter's walk in Carrick and Galloway. V. Forest notes. On the plains. In the season. Idle hours. A pleasure party. The woods in spring. Morality. 6. A mountain town in France. 7. Random memories. Rosa quo locorum. 8. The ideal house. 9. Davos in winter. X. Health and mountains. 11. Alpine diversion. 12. The stimulation of the Alps. 13. Roads. 14. On the enjoyment of unpleasant places. Chapter 1. The amateur emigrant. The second cabin. I first encountered my fellow passengers on the Bromelaw in Glasgow. Thence we descended the Clyde in no familiar spirit, but looking askance on each other as on possible enemies. A few Scandinavians, who had already grown acquainted on the North Sea, were friendly and voluble over their long pipes, but among English speakers distance and suspicion reigned supreme. The sun was soon overclouded. The wind freshened and grew sharp as we continued to descend the widening estuary, and, with the falling temperature, the gloom among the passengers increased. 2 of the women wept. Anyone who had come aboard might have supposed we were all absconding from the law. There was scarce a word interchanged, and no common sentiment but that of cold united us, until at length, having touched at Greenock, a pointing arm and a rush to the starboard now announced that our ocean steamer was in sight. There she lay in mid-river, at the tail of the bank, her sea signal flying, a wall of bulwark, a street of white deckhouses, an aspiring forest of spars, larger than a church, and soon to be as populous as many an incorporated town in the land to which she was to bear us. I was not, in truth, a steerage passenger. Although anxious to see the worst of emigrant life, I had some work to finish on the voyage, and was advised to go by the second cabin, where at least I should have a table at command. The advice was excellent, but to understand the choice, and what I gained, some outline of the internal disposition of the ship will first be necessary. In her very nose is steerage number 1, down 2 pair of stairs. A little abaft, another companion, labeled steerage number 2 and 3, gives admission to 3 galleries, 2 running forward towards steerage number 1, and the third aft towards the engines. The starboard forward gallery is the second cabin. Away abaft the engines and below the officers' cabins, to complete our survey of the vessel, there is yet a third nest of steerages, labeled 4 and 5. The second cabin, to return, is thus a modified oasis in the very heart of the steerages. Through the thin partition you can hear the steerage passengers being sick, the rattle of tin dishes as they sit at meals, the varied accents in which they converse, the crying of their children terrified by this new experience, or the clean flat smack of the parental hand in chastisement. There are, however, many advantages for the inhabitant of this strip. He does not require to bring his own bedding or dishes, but finds berths and a table completely, if somewhat roughly furnished. He enjoys a distinct superiority in diet, but this, strange to say, differs not only on different ships, but on the same ship according as her head is to the east or west. In my own experience, the principal difference between our table and that of the true steerage passenger was the table itself, and the crockery plates from which we ate. But lest I should show myself ungrateful, let me recapitulate every advantage. At breakfast, we had a choice between tea and coffee for beverage, a choice not easy to make. The two were so surprisingly alike. I found that I could sleep after the coffee and lay awake after the tea, which is proof conclusive of some chemical disparity. And even by the palate, I could distinguish a smack of snuff in the former from a flavor of boiling and dishcloths in the second. As a matter of fact, I have seen passengers, after many sips, still doubting which had been supplied them. In the way of eatables at the same meal, we were gloriously favored, for in addition to porridge, which was common to all, we had Irish stew, sometimes a bit of fish, and sometimes rissoles. The dinner of soup, roast fresh beef, boiled salt junk, and potatoes was, I believe, exactly common to the steerage and the second cabin. Only I have heard it rumored that our potatoes were of a superior brand, and twice a week, on pudding days, instead of duff, we had a saddlebag filled with currants under the name of a plum pudding. At tea we were served with some broken meat from the saloon, sometimes in the comparatively elegant form of spare patties or rissoles, but as a general thing mere chicken bones and flakes of fish, neither hot nor cold. If these were not the scrapings of plates, their looks belied them sorely. Yet we were all too hungry to be proud, and fell to these leavings greedily. These, the bread, which was excellent, and the soup and porridge, which were both good, formed my whole diet throughout the voyage, so that except for the broken meat and the convenience of a table, I might as well have been in the steerage outright. Had they given me porridge again in the evening, I should have been perfectly contented with the fare. As it was, with a few biscuits and some whiskey and water before turning in, I kept my body going and my spirits up to the mark. The last particular in which the second cabin passenger remarkably stands ahead of his brother of the steerage is one altogether of sentiment. In the steerage there are males and females. In the second cabin, ladies and gentlemen. For some time after I came aboard, I thought I was only a male. But in the course of a voyage of discovery between decks, I came on a brass plate, and learned that I was still a gentleman. Nobody knew it, of course. I was lost in the crowd of males and females, and rigorously confined to the same quarter of the deck. Who could tell whether I housed on the port or starboard side of steerage number 2 and 3? And it was only there that my superiority became practical. Everywhere else I was incognito, moving among my inferiors with simplicity, not so much as a swagger to indicate that I was a gentleman after all, and had broken meat to tea. Still, I was like one with a patent of nobility in a drawer at home, and when I felt out of spirits I could go down and refresh myself with a look of that brass plate. For all these advantages I paid but 2 guineas. 6 guineas is the steerage fare. 8 that by the second cabin. And when you remember that the steerage passenger must supply bedding and dishes, and, in 5 cases out of 10, either brings some dainties with him, or privately pays the steward for extra rations, the difference in price becomes almost nominal. Air comparatively fit to breathe, food comparatively varied, and the satisfaction of being still privately a gentleman may thus be had almost for the asking. 2 of my fellow passengers in the second cabin had already made the passage by the cheaper fare, and declared it was an experiment not to be repeated. As I go on to tell about my steerage friends, the reader will perceive that they were not alone in their opinion. Out of 10 with whom I was more or less intimate, I am sure not fewer than 5 vowed, if they returned, to travel second cabin, and all who had left their wives behind them assured me they would go without the comfort of their presence until they could afford to bring them by saloon. Our party in the second cabin was not perhaps the most interesting on board. Perhaps even in the saloon there was as much goodwill and character. Yet it had some elements of curiosity. There was a mixed group of Swedes, Danes, and Norsemen, one of whom, generally known by the name of Johnny, in spite of his own protests, greatly diverted us by his clever, cross-country efforts to speak English, and became on the strength of that an universal favorite. It takes so little in this world of shipboard to create a popularity. There was, besides, a Scots mason, known from his favorite dish as Irish stew. 3 or 4 nondescript Scots, a fine young Irishman, O'Reilly, and a pair of young men who deserve a special word of condemnation. One of them was Scots, the other claimed to be American, admitted, after some fencing, that he was born in England, and ultimately proved to be an Irishman born and nurtured, but ashamed to own his country. He had a sister on board, whom he faithfully neglected throughout the voyage, though she was not only sick, but much his senior, and had nursed and cared for him in childhood. In appearance, he was like an imbecile Henry III of France. The Scotsman, though perhaps as big an ass, was not so dead of heart, and I have only bracketed them together because they were fast friends and disgraced themselves equally by their conduct at the table. Next, to turn to topics more agreeable, we had a newly married couple, devoted to each other, with a pleasant story of how they had first seen each other years ago at a preparatory school. And that very afternoon he had carried her books home for her. I do not know if this story will be plain to Southern readers, but to me it recalls many a school idyll, with wrathful swains of 8 and 9 confronting each other's stride legs, flushed with jealousy. For to carry home a young lady's books was both a delicate attention and a privilege. Then there was an old lady, or indeed, I am not sure that she was as much old as antiquated and strangely out of place, who had left her husband and was traveling all the way to Kansas by herself. We had to take her own word that she was married, for it was sorely contradicted by the testimony of her appearance. Nature seemed to have sanctified her for the single state. Even the color of her hair was incompatible with matrimony, and her husband, I thought, should be a man of saintly spirit and phantasmal bodily presence. She was ill, poor thing. Her soul turned from the viands. The dirty tablecloth shocked her like an impropriety, and the whole strength of her endeavor was bent upon keeping her watch true to Glasgow time till she should reach New York. They had heard reports, her husband and she, of some unwarrantable disparity of hours between these two cities, and with a spirit commendably scientific, had seized on this occasion to put them to the proof. It was a good thing for the old lady, for she passed much leisure time in studying the watch. Once, when prostrated by sickness, she let it run down. It was inscribed on her harmless mind in letters of adamant that the hands of a watch must never be turned backwards, and so it behoved her to lie in wait for the exact moment, ere she started it again. When she imagined this was about due, she sought out one of the young second-cabin Scotsmen, who was embarked on the same experiment as herself and had hitherto been less neglectful. She was in quest of 2 o'clock, and when she learned it was already 7 on the shores of Clyde, she lifted up her voice and cried gravy. I had not heard this innocent expletive since I was a young child, and I suppose it must have been the same with the other Scotsmen present, for we all laughed our fill. Last but not least, I come to my excellent friend, Mr. Jones. It would be difficult to say whether I was his right-hand man, or he mine, during the voyage. Thus at table I carved, while he only scooped gravy. But at our concerts, of which more anon, he was the president who called up performers to sing, and I but his messenger who ran his errands and pleaded privately with the overmodest. I knew I liked Mr. Jones from the moment I saw him. I thought him by his face to be Scottish, nor could his accent undeceive me. For as there is a lingua franca of many tongues on the moles and in the feluccas of the Mediterranean, so there is a free or common accent among English-speaking men who follow the sea. They catch a twang in a New England port from a Cockney skipper. Even a Scotsman sometimes learns to drop an H. A word of a dialect is picked up from another band in the forecastle, until often the result is undecipherable, and you have to ask for the man's place of birth. So it was with Mr. Jones. I thought him a Scotsman who had been long to sea, and yet he was from Wales, and had been most of his life a blacksmith at an inland forge, a few years in America and half a score of ocean voyages having sufficed to modify his speech into the common pattern. By his own account, he was both strong and skillful in his trade. A few years back, He had been married and after a fashion a rich man. Now the wife was dead and the money gone. But his was the nature that looks forward and goes on from one year to another and through all the extremities of fortune undismayed. And if the sky were to fall tomorrow, I should look to see Jones, the day following, perched on a stepladder and getting things to rights. He was always hovering round inventions like a bee over a flower, and lived in a dream of patents. He had with him a patent medicine, for instance, the composition of which he had bought years ago for $5 from an American peddler, and sold the other day for £100, I think it was, to an English apothecary. It was called golden oil, cured all maladies without exception, and I am bound to say that I partook of it myself with good results. It is a character of the man that he was not only perpetually dosing himself with golden oil, but wherever there was a head aching or a finger cut, there would be Jones with his bottle. If he had one taste more strongly than another, it was to study character. Many an hour have we two walked upon the deck dissecting our neighbors in a spirit that was too purely scientific to be called unkind, whenever a quaint or human trait slipped out in conversation. You might have seen Jones and me exchanging glances, and we could hardly go to bed in comfort till we had exchanged notes and discussed the day's experience. We were then like a couple of anglers comparing a day's kill. But the fish we angled for were of a metaphysical species, and we angled as often as not in one another's baskets. Once, in the midst of a serious talk, each found there was a scrutinizing eye upon himself. I own I paused in embarrassment at this double detection, but Jones, with a better civility, broke into a peal of unaffected laughter, and declared, what was the truth, that there was a pair of us indeed. Early impressions. We steamed out of the Clyde on Thursday night, and early on the Friday forenoon we took in our last batch of emigrants at Loch Foyle, in Ireland, and said farewell to Europe. The company was now complete, and began to draw together, by inscrutable magnetisms, upon the decks. There were Scots and Irish in plenty, a few English, a few Americans, a good handful of Scandinavians, a German or two, and one Russian, all now belonging for 10 days to one small iron country on the deep. As I walked the deck and looked round upon my fellow passengers, thus curiously assorted from all northern Europe, I began for the first time to understand the nature of emigration. Day by day throughout the passage, and thenceforward across all the states, and on to the shores of the Pacific, this knowledge grew more clear and melancholy. Emigration, from a word of the most cheerful import, came to sound most dismally in my ear. There is nothing more agreeable to picture, and nothing more pathetic to behold. The abstract idea, as conceived at home, is hopeful and adventurous. A young man, you fancy, scorning restraints and helpers, issues forth into life, that great battle, to fight for his own hand. The most pleasant stories of ambition, of difficulties overcome, and of ultimate success, are but as episodes to this great epic of self-help. The epic is composed of individual heroisms. It stands to them as the victorious war which subdued an empire stands to the personal act of bravery which spiked a single cannon and was adequately rewarded with a medal. For in emigration the young men enter direct and by the shipload on their heritage of work. Empty continents swarm, as at the bosun's whistle, with industrious hands, and whole new empires are domesticated to the service of man. This is the closet picture, and is found, on trial, to consist mostly of embellishments. The more I saw of my fellow passengers, the less I was tempted to the lyric note. Comparatively few of the men were below 30. Many were married, and encumbered with families. Not a few were already up in years. And this itself was out of tune with my imaginations, for the ideal emigrant should certainly be young. Again, I thought he should offer to the eye some bold type of humanity, with bluff or hawk-like features, and the stamp of an eager and pushing disposition. Now those around me were for the most part quiet, orderly, obedient citizens, family men broken by adversity, elderly youths who had failed to place themselves in life, and people who had seen better days. Mildness was the prevailing character. Mild mirth and mild endurance. In a word, I was not taking part in an impetuous and conquering sally, such as swept over Mexico or Siberia, but found myself, like Marmion, in the lost battle, borne down by the flying. Laboring mankind had in the last years, and throughout Great Britain, sustained a prolonged and crushing series of defeats. I had heard vaguely of these reverses, of whole streets of houses standing deserted by the Tyne, the cellar doors broken and removed for firewood, of homeless men loitering at the street corners of Glasgow with their chests beside them, of closed factories, useless strikes, and starving girls. But I had never taken them home to me or represented these distresses livingly to my imagination. A turn of the market may be a calamity as disastrous as the French retreat from Moscow, but it hardly lends itself to lively treatment and makes a trifling figure in the morning papers. We may struggle as we please. We are not born economists. The individual is more affecting than the mass. It is by the scenic accidents and the appeal to the carnal eye that for the most part we grasp the significance of tragedies. Thus it was only now, when I found myself involved in the rout, that I began to appreciate how sharp had been the battle. We were a company of the rejected, the drunken, the incompetent, the weak, the prodigal. All who had been unable to prevail against circumstances in the one land were now fleeing pitifully to another, and though one or two might still succeed, all had already failed. We were a ship full of failures, the broken men of England. Yet it must not be supposed that these people exhibited depression. The scene, on the contrary, was cheerful. Not a tear was shed on board the vessel. All were full of hope for the future, and showed an inclination to innocent gaiety. Some were heard to sing, and all began to scrape acquaintance with small jests and ready laughter. The children found each other out like dogs, and ran about the decks scraping acquaintance after their fashion also. "What do you call your mither?" I heard one ask.
"Mama,"
was the reply, indicating, I fancy, a shade of difference in the social scale. When people pass each other on the high seas of life at so early an age, the contact is but slight, and the relation more like what we may imagine to be the friendship of flies than that of men. It is so quickly joined,
so easily dissolved,
so open in its communications, and so devoid of deeper human qualities.